Hi, my name is Katarina Sullivan and I would like to welcome you to my YouTube channel. Namaste and welcome to episode 5 of How Not to Have a Mental Breakdown at the Polling Place on Election Day. So last video we spoke about how to fill out one of those crazy Senate ballot papers. We made it, guys. We got through that video and everything's going to be amazing from here on out if you understand maths. You remember how in high school you'd be learning maths and you're like, we're never ever going to use this again in real life? Well, you're going to use it today. Pretty much everything you've ever learned in maths in your entire life, except maybe Pythagorean theorem. So the Senate vote count is so complicated that it usually can't be finished on election night. I don't think anywhere in the history of voting has a full Senate count been finalized on election night. Let me just sort of give you a picture of how complicated Senate voting is. When I was writing notes for this, I did a page of notes on the lower house and 6 pages of notes on the upper house. So as I said last video, in the 2019 election, we are only electing 6 senators from each state, 6 sixes, 36, and 2 senators from each territory. So all up, 40 senators will be elected at this election. Last election, we elected 76 senators, and that's because Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, or ex-Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, called what is known as a double dissolution election. So he actually cleared the whole Senate out. He was like, all of y'all gotta go. So when senators are elected, they are elected for a 6-year term from the 1st of July to the 30th of June. So it runs on the financial year, which is different to the House of Representatives. They're elected for a 3-year term and they run based on when Parliament is called and when it is dismissed. In the last election, we voted in 12 senators for each state and 2 senators for each territory. And an important thing to note here is that territory senators never get a 6-year term. They always work on 3-year terms. So I feel sorry for them because they've got to work twice as hard as their state counterparts. So last election, as I said, we voted in 12 senators for each state, 2 senators for each territory. The top 6 senators were given a 6-year term and the bottom 6 senators were given a 3-year term. So those bottom 6 senators' terms expire on 30th of June 2019 and those places are up for grabs. Some senators are throwing their hat back in the ring to be re-elected, but there's actually an overwhelming number of new senators who are hoping to come through. Okay, the first step when counting the Senate votes is to take all of the informal votes, which are ballot papers that are filled out incorrectly, and put them to the side. Let's just, over there, thank you. Now from the formal ballot papers, we then start to count the votes. I'm already wanting to cry from the maths. Guys, help. The first thing we need to work out when we count the Senate votes is what is called a quota. And we can't know the quota until election night. The quota is calculated through a mathematical equation, the number of formal ballot papers divided by the number of senators to be elected plus 1, and then that whole thing rounded down and you add 1, and that's the quota. Let's hypothetically say there are 1 million formal votes on election night, and we're working for a state right now. So you divide that by 6 plus 1, which is 7. And that whole number gets rounded down, and then you add 1, and that's the quota. And that's the number of votes that a senator needs to achieve in order to be elected immediately to the Senate. So the reason we can't work out the quota ahead of time is because we don't know how many people are going to show up to vote and how many people are going to fill out the ballot paper correctly, so we don't know how many formal votes we're going to have. So once all the polling places are closed and those sealed ballot boxes are ripped open, that's when we can start counting how many papers there are and actually work out what the quota is for each state and territory. So like I said, those candidates that have received the quota or more are elected immediately. Now, last video we spoke about below the line voting versus above the line voting. The votes are actually counted separately. So below the line votes are counted separately to above the line votes. Below the line votes are obviously put in a process from 1 to 12. That all first preference votes go in a pile and you work it from there. So above the line voting take the preferences into account, and it's a lot more confusing, but the same basic principle is used. So in the example I used just before of 1 million formal votes divided by 6 plus 1, so the number of senators to be elected plus 1 divided by 7, and then that whole equation rounded down and then plus 1, we get an answer of 142,858. So that is the quota that is needed for someone to be elected immediately into the Senate. Because I get to control these examples, I'm going to give myself a winning situation in which the candidate that I put first gets over the quota needed. So you'll remember in the example I used last video, grapefruit got my first preference on the Senate paper. Let's say grapefruit got 250,000 first preference votes. So they have exceeded the quota of 142,858 votes required to meet the quota. Oh, I'm like starting to sweat thinking about how to explain this process. What happens next is the surplus votes get transferred from that candidate to the second preference. Now this is where it gets tricky. Grapefruit had 107,142 surplus votes. So that means that they exceeded the quota by 107,000 whatever I just said votes. Because you don't know which 107,142 votes are actually the surplus, so you don't know which ones cross the line first, if that makes sense, in terms of getting the candidate to reach that quota, the entire stack of votes are transferred to the second preference, but they're transferred at a reduced rate. This reduced rate is known as the transfer value. Do you see why I want to cry? The transfer value is calculated by the surplus divided by the number of votes first preference for the candidate. For example, in this instance, we're using 107,142 as the surplus divided by 250,000, and that's equal to 0.43, rounded up, before anyone tries to check my maths. So the second preference vote, let's say my ballot paper I filled out, the second preference vote will then go down to the next candidate in that party. So Mandarin will receive my second preference vote, but instead of counting it as one whole vote, it will be counted as 0.43 of a vote. Mind blown. So I hope that's making as little sense to you as it is to me. It actually does kind of make sense in this really weird, twisted way, but it's a full-on process. Like, this is intense. We keep working down someone's preferences until eventually we get 6 senators elected. For example, let's say that my vote was taken and we go all the way down to vote number 12, and still we haven't got 6 senators elected from the end of using my ballot paper. My vote will then be counted as what is known as an exhausted vote. So we've exhausted all the options that I filled out on my ballot paper, and it gets put to the side. In this process, there is a chance that a candidate can be elected before reaching the quota if all votes have been exhausted. I think that that's pretty much the basics covered. That's all you really need to know about this crazy, insane, complicated process, because there's a lot of maths there. So just a really quick recap, the first thing that's calculated on election night is what the quota is, which is the number of formal votes for a state or territory divided by the number of senators that need to be elected for that state or territory plus 1. So that number will either be 7 or 3. 7 for states and 3 for territories. Then that whole equation completed and rounded down, and then you add 1. That's your quota. The next step is that ballot papers get put into piles based on first preference votes. Any candidate that reaches the quota from first preference votes alone gets immediately voted in. Their ballot papers are then taken and another equation is done, which is known as a transfer value equation, which is the number of votes that are surplus to the quota. So that will be number of votes for the candidate minus quota equals surplus. And then surplus divided by the number of first preference votes is your transfer value. So second preference votes will be transferred at a reduced rate, which is the rate of the transfer value. And this process keeps happening for second, third, fourth preferences. We keep going down the line until we have 6 or 2 senators elected to the states and territories respectively. And that is the nightmare that is the Senate counting process. The counting process, of course, will be a lot more simple this year because we're only electing half a Senate, which is normal. We normally only elect half a Senate. Last election, we had a double dissolution, which is abnormal, out of the ordinary, and that is why the process was a little bit more intense last year. Next video, we're going to cover what the changes were in 2016 to the Senate voting paper and how that actually might affect us more this year because of the fact it's a half Senate election. We're also going to talk about a few tips and tricks to understand voting preferences based on the new system of voting and how to avoid getting people in that you don't want in. And that will then be the end of our how to fill out ballot paper and all of that nonsense videos. And then we can move on to party policies, candidate policies, how to understand different policies, how to analyze them, where to get your information, where to fact check your information, because fake news is real, people. The amount of stuff I've seen on TV that I'm like, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true. It's not Donald Trump being paranoid. Like, fake news is real. And so we're going to talk about how to get accurate information this election, unbiased information, where to check your facts at the door before you walk into the polling place. And we'll also explain some of the complicated policies that people have asked me to explain on my Instagram questionnaire that I put out last week. I'm going to put another one out in the next few days to get anything else that's come up in the last week or so during the campaign period. Please, if you have questions, put them in the comments below or DM me on social media. All of my handles or links to the platforms are below. Or you can find me on my website and put in a contact form. Any questions you might have, please ask them. I will answer them best I can. And please like the video or give it a thumbs up, whichever term you prefer. Subscribe to my channel. Like I said, follow me on social media, all the things. Share the video, share. Make sure everyone understands this process before May 18th. And ask your friends, like going down to the pub for beers, just be like, yo, do you know how to vote at this election? Because if you don't, you need to learn. Check out this video because hopefully I'm helping. Hopefully I'm not confusing you. Stay informed, stay alert, keep reading about the election, keep asking your candidates questions, and I can't wait to see you next video. Bye.